Hello. So today I'm going to talk about the creation story from Uganda and Joseph Campbell's theory of the path of the hero. So just to give you some background on the creation story, it's an African creation story that follows the same pattern as most others. The story explains the how and why, meaning the how we became to be on Earth and why we came to be on Earth, and also why death exists. This creation story originated in Uganda. The story itself describes a legendary ancestor of kings of Buganda named Kintu, and the entire story is about him coming to Uganda, which at first is just a barren sort of wasteland, and how he starts a family by intermarriage with gods. While this is the main storyline, there's an underlying story that goes along with it of a man trying to prove himself to the father of a woman he wants to marry. Switching gears to the theory that we're going to be applying to this, Joseph Campbell believes that despite the infinite variety of setting and incident, all myths follow the same pattern. He refers to this concept as the monomyth, or the no matter where you look, you'll see the pattern emerge sort of concept. So he believes that all myths follow the same path from start to finish, and they all encompass generally the same type of concepts. And he also believes that mythological adventure of the hero is related primarily to rites of passage throughout life. So to outline his concept of the path of the hero, we start with separation or departure, and this includes 5 subsections, which are the call to adventure, refusal of the call, supernatural aid, crossing the first threshold, and in the belly of the whale. So within this creation story, separation or departure is the retreat from the world. It's here where our main character will find the resolution of his conflicts and his fears. The call to adventure here starts at the beginning of the story. So Kintu is on Earth, which is this barren wasteland, and all he has with him is his cow, who is his food and drink. And 2 girls come down from heaven and come across this man, and they had never seen a man before. Eventually they have conversation with Kintu and end up going back to heaven to report back to their father that they did come across a human. The father then sent down his sons to steal the cow of our main character, Kintu. And the entire story is based around how he will go to heaven to steal back his cow, and then eventually he ends up winning the daughter's hand in marriage. But so the call to adventure is him going to heaven in order to get back his cow. Refusal of the call is technically the next step outlined by Campbell, and in this story it's not actually applicable, which is like the first hole within applying this theory to the story. Supernatural aid is the third part of this. While tackling the tests that the father has in place for Kintu in order to get back his cow, Kintu receives aid from a talking axe, a hornet, and a bucket during 3 different trials. It's this supernatural aid that helps Kintu eventually accomplish his goal. Crossing the first threshold refers to starting Kintu's first adventure, which I guess in this case could be considered him just leaving Uganda to go to heaven. And in the belly of the whale is the second hole within this theory, because it's not applicable. It refers to a form of death that the character meets, which our character does not come to death or have any sort of relation to sort of like a mental lapse or anything that can be considered death, essentially. The second part is the meat of the story, and this is what Campbell refers to as the trials and the victories. The first part of Trials and Victories is the Road of Trials. This is where our main character proves his merit, and he's tempted by evil, and eventually he is able to overcome and win back the cow and essentially the daughter. The first trial that he comes across is to create firewood out of stones for the father, and he has to chop rock with like a copper axe. Axe aids him and encourages Kintu to strike and break the rocks so he can bring them back to the father. The second trial is that he must collect dew from the grass, and again the bucket speaks up and tells him that all is well and that he magically has water within the bucket. The third task is that he has to find his own cow amongst a herd of 3,000 other cows, and a hornet eventually comes to help him with this, essentially. Now, this is where the theory really starts to have a lot of holes in it when you're trying to apply it to this particular story. Goddesses, there isn't necessarily a goddess within this story. Women as the temptress. In this story, the wife-to-be, the daughter, isn't necessarily like a traditional temptress, and instead, at the end of all of the trials, when the father sends Kintu back to Earth with gifts and his wife and essentially a dowry, they forget something, and they are under strict instructions not to return back to heaven to get what they forgot. And there's an opportunity here for the daughter to say, hey, you should go back and do this. You should go back and get what the article that we forgot. And instead of listening, to her, he would then be tempted or whatever. But that doesn't actually happen within this story. Instead, Kintu makes the decision himself to go back and break the word of the father, which then leads to problems down the road. So I don't see this being applicable at all within this story. Same with the next step, which is atonement with the father, which is technically, Campbell says, is when the hero will take revenge on the father for all of the wrongdoings that he's caused him. This doesn't happen. In fact, the father ends up helping or attempting to help Kintu later on down the road. So again, another hole in the theory that is completely not applicable to this. The next part of Trials and Victories, as told by Campbell, is, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, apotheosis. And that's when the hero comes to an understanding that the spiritual side of human existence is as real as the physical part. And while this is slightly touched upon in the story, it's definitely not as highlighted as in many of the other myths that we've read. And then finally is the ultimate boon, which is, in this case, the elixir of food for Uganda to make it into a home and a world where people can live and thrive. The third part of this theory that Campbell has is called the return. Now, he's very clear in stating that sometimes this part of the theory is omitted from many myths, and I found that to be completely accurate, particularly within this. I mean, as you can kind of tell, there are a lot of holes in this theory when applied to a story like this one, and it completely falls apart at this point. Refusal to return is not applicable because our hero has no problem returning to Earth whatsoever. He is looking forward to it. The magic flight would be fleeing from whatever tribulations he had just faced, and again, totally not applicable. He rocked out his trials no problem and again was looking forward to returning to Earth, even with his wife. Rescue from without, yet again, not applicable. If anything, I would say that crossing the return threshold is applicable because that's just the main character returning to Earth back into his home, and where he's the master of two worlds and has the freedom to live, which are the last two parts. Clearly he has the freedom to live. But kind of in conclusion, it's really safe to say that Campbell's theory encompasses some, but not all, of the creation story. I kind of made a point throughout this to point out the inconsistencies. But I tend to believe when it comes to theories that we try and fit a myth into a theory as opposed to looking at the myth in entirety. And I think that clearly has happened during my entire attempt at analysis here. Hero of a Thousand Faces lays down stages that a hero undergoes, right? And our hero definitely went through some of those stages, but about halfway through, our hero, I mean, looking at our hero through the lens of this theory, he completely strays from the norm. So does that mean that this really isn't a theory? Clearly not. But I just thought that was interesting, interesting to note. So overall, I generally think that applying this particular theory to myths and legends is a little too broad. And I think that individual experiences are what drive the story in the end. I just don't think that Campbell's theory is universal enough to act as a distinguisher of what denotes a theory or a myth, excuse me, or what doesn't.